With 9 days before she lost both her job and her room, Miriam Tate rode through an early New Mexico snowstorm and asked the quietest cowboy in Ash Creek to marry her until spring, only to step inside his ranch house and find her initials carved into a desk that had been waiting there for years. The wind was still driving snow across Abel Grayson's cattle gate when Miriam made her offer. Marriage until spring. She would keep his books, he would give her wages, a roof, and room to rebuild her freight business. Abel's hand tightened once around the iron gate hook. Then the towering rancher simply asked, "What morning do you want to see the justice of the peace?" But inside his house, Miriam found a freight office prepared with the ink she used, and beneath the desk, 2 worn letters, MT. She had never been inside that house before. Stay with Miriam a little longer, and tell me, would you have asked Abel about those initials? Snow came early to Ash Creek in November of 1887. By noon, wagon wheels had cut black grooves through the white road outside the freight office, and Miriam Tate had learned she had 9 days before both her job and the room above it disappeared. She read the notice twice. The building had been sold. Freight operations would close at month's end. Her room upstairs went with it. Miriam folded the paper along its old crease and slipped it into her coat pocket. Then she counted what remained in her purse. Not enough. The office door opened before she finished. Wesley Dyer stepped inside, brushing snow from his shoulders. At 51, he had made himself useful to nearly every cattleman around Ash Creek. He bought cattle, arranged freight, loaned money when winter feed ran short. He placed a folded offer beside Miriam's ledger. "I could use someone who understands figures." The wages written there were better than hers. Miriam looked at the paper, then at Dyer. 3 weeks earlier, she had compared 2 weight slips from the same cattle shipment. The numbers had changed between Ash Creek and the railhead. Another invoice had charged the same wagon twice. She had said nothing. She folded Dyer's offer and pushed it back. "I'll manage." His eyes stayed on her a moment. 9 days isn't much time. No. He put on his hat and left. That night, Miriam sat beside the small stove in her upstairs room with her father's ledger across her knees. Beyond the glass, wind drove snow along the roofs of Ash Creek. She had spent years saving toward one thing, the old Tate parcel beside the freight road. Her father had once talked about putting a stock stop there. Fresh horses, water, feed. A place where wagon crews could rest before climbing toward Raton Pass. The land was gone now, but the idea wasn't. For 3 nights, Miriam considered every respectable arrangement she could make. Only one survived the arithmetic. On the 4th morning, she saddled a borrowed mare and rode 7 miles out of town. Grayson Cattle Ranch sat beneath dark pine ridges, its fences disappearing into blowing snow. Abel Grayson was repairing a gate when she arrived. He straightened. People in Ash Creek called him Big Grayson. At 6'7", he earned the name without needing to perform for it. His coat stretched across broad shoulders, and years of rope, timber, cattle, and frozen fence wire had left his hands rough and heavy. Yet when Miriam dismounted, Abel did not crowd her. He stepped back. "Miss Tate. Mr. Grayson." She had practiced the words until they sounded like bookkeeping. Now they didn't. "I need to make you a proposal." His hand remained around the iron gate hook. Miriam kept her chin level. "Marriage until spring." The hook creaked once beneath Abel's grip. That was all. She explained the terms. She would keep his books, review contracts, purchase supplies, and prepare his accounts before cattle sales. He would pay her wages, give her a room, and allow her use of the strip near the freight road so she could begin rebuilding her own business when winter broke. She expected questions. Instead, Abel loosened his hand from the hook. "What morning do you want to see the justice of the peace?" For the first time, Miriam lost the next sentence she had prepared. "You understand what I'm offering?" "I heard you. No promises beyond spring." "I heard that too." He walked toward the barn to saddle his sorrel. Miriam watched him go. A man surprised by a marriage proposal ought to look surprised. Abel Grayson looked like a man trying very hard not to show anything at all. While she waited, Miriam stepped inside the ranch house to warm her hands. The kitchen was plain and clean. Coffee sat in an enamel pot near the stove. Beside it was a narrow room she had not noticed from outside. She pushed the door open. A writing desk stood beneath a south-facing window. Not the decorative desk, a working one. The drawers were deep enough for account books. Freight maps were pinned neatly to the wall. On the shelf sat a bottle of blue-black ink, the same kind Miriam bought whenever Edna Pritchard managed to get it at the general store. Miriam touched the desk. Then she noticed marks beneath the center drawer. She bent closer. 2 letters had been carved into the wood. MT. The cuts were not fresh. Their edges had been rubbed smooth with age. Outside, a saddle buckle rang against wood. Miriam straightened. Abel appeared in the doorway a moment later, hat in hand. Ready? Her eyes went once toward the initials, then back to him. Yes. She did not ask. Not yet. They rode toward Ash Creek beneath a low gray sky. Whenever the wind crossed the open ground, Abel quietly moved his sorrel to the weather side of her mare. His body took the worst of the blowing snow. He never mentioned it. At the courthouse, he dismounted first and held Miriam's reins while she stepped down. Then he moved aside and waited for her to climb the steps before him. Miriam looked back once. The largest man in Ash Creek stood below her in the snow, making no move to hurry her. 9 days ago, she had needed a roof. Now she might have one. But as she reached for the courthouse door, it wasn't the marriage that troubled her. It was a desk built years before she had ever asked to come, and 2 worn letters beneath its drawer. MT, the marriage took less than 15 minutes. The justice of the peace spoke from behind a scarred walnut desk, while snow melted from Abel's boots onto the courthouse floor. Edna Pritchard stood near the window in her dark wool dress. Samuel Phelps signed as the second witness, then sanded the ink and blew the grains away. Miriam wrote her name carefully. Abel's came after hers. Large letters, steady hand. When it was done, there was no kiss, no celebration waiting outside. Abel only held the courthouse door while Miriam stepped into the cold. By sunset, her trunk sat at the foot of the spare bed at Grayson Ranch. She unpacked her father's ledger first. The next morning, Abel placed 3 keys on the kitchen table. Pantry, strongbox, desk. Miriam looked at the middle key. The ranch money? You said you'd keep the books. Most men don't hand over their cash box on the first morning. Abel poured coffee into an enamel cup. Most men don't marry their bookkeeper on the first morning. For half a second, Miriam thought he might be joking. Then she saw the corner of his mouth move. Barely. It was the first time she had seen him come close to a smile. The days settled into a rhythm. Before sunrise, Abel went to the cattle. Miriam worked through invoices beside the south window. The old MT hidden beneath the desk drawer close enough to touch, but never mentioned. On the 3rd day, Abel led a bay mare from the barn. Her name's Juniper. The mare tossed her head and watched Miriam with bright, suspicious eyes. She doesn't look easy. She isn't. Miriam ran one hand down Juniper's neck. Good. Abel looked at her. You don't like horses that just follow. She turned. How would you know that? Juniper mouthed the bit. Abel adjusted the cheek strap. I've seen you ride at the freight yard. Nothing more. But Miriam remembered every time she had crossed Ash Creek on horseback over the past few years, and wondered how often Abel had been somewhere nearby. Other small things began to gather. The woodpile beside the kitchen had been stacked 1 row lower than the barn pile. The water bucket she used most was lighter than the others. In the evenings, Abel always moved the lantern toward her side of the table before opening whatever paper he meant to read. He never explained any of it. Miriam did not ask. Not yet. By the second week, the books began to speak. Salt purchases were too high. Feed prices were worse. Abel had been buying through a middleman who added charges at every step. Miriam rode into Ash Creek with 3 old receipts tucked inside her coat and spent most of an afternoon at Pritchard's store, arguing figures with a supplier from Trinidad. She returned after dark. Abel was splitting kindling beside the barn. "I changed the winter feed order," she said. He rested the axe head on the chopping block. "How bad?" "Better by $78 and enough salt money to cover the south herd until February." Abel said nothing. Miriam waited. Then he walked inside, opened the strongbox, took the small iron key from his ring, and set it beside her hand. "The main cash drawer." She stared at it. "You already gave me access." "Not that drawer." Their eyes met. No praise, no speech, just a key. Miriam closed her fingers around it. 2 evenings later, she found the first real trouble. A freight invoice from Dyer listed a wagon run twice. Same date, same driver, same number of cattle, different total. She checked another receipt, then another. The weights changed between copies. Abel stood behind her chair, reading over her shoulder. "I'll write in tomorrow." Miriam put her palm flat on the ledger. "No." His gaze dropped to her hand. "Dyer's stealing from you." "I know. He may be doing it to others." "I know that too." Abel reached for his coat. Miriam did not move her hand. "That's exactly why you don't go." He looked at her. She nodded toward the gun belt hanging beside the door. "A man like Wesley Dyer doesn't need to beat you. He only needs half the town to see Big Grayson angry in the street. After that, nobody talks about bad invoices. They talk about you." The room went still. Abel's jaw tightened once. Then he unbuckled the gun belt he had just fastened. He hung it back on the peg. "Keep looking." So she did. The following afternoon, Miriam needed an old survey map for the creek parcel. She opened the writing desk. One drawer, then another. At the back of the lowest compartment, her fingers touched paper wrapped in oilcloth. She pulled it free. The document inside bore the county seal. Tax sale deed, 6 years old. Miriam read the property description once. Then again. The old Tate parcel, her father's land, the strip beside the freight road she had spent years dreaming of buying back. Her eyes moved to the purchaser's name. Abel Grayson. The porch boards groaned outside. Bootsteps crossed the snow, slow, heavy, coming toward the door. Miriam folded the deed, slid it back into the drawer, and pushed it shut. Then, for the first time since coming to Grayson Ranch, she turned the key. Abel came in carrying snow on his shoulders and a coil of fence wire under one arm. Miriam was already at the stove. He set the wire by the door, poured coffee, and asked if she had found the survey map. Not yet. It was the first lie she had told him since the marriage. The words stayed with her all night. By morning, the sky had cleared hard and blue. Miriam saddled Juniper before Abel came in from the north pasture. "I need to check something in town." He glanced at the mare, then at her coat. "Road's icy near Miller Creek." "I'll take the lower grade." Abel nodded. No questions. That made it worse. Samuel Phelps was alone in the courthouse records room when Miriam arrived. A coal stove ticked in the corner. Shelves of deed books climbed the walls, their leather spines cracked and dusty. She laid the description of the Tate parcel in front of him. "I need the tax sale record." Samuel's eyes lifted to hers, then dropped to the page. He moved slowly after that. The deed book showed exactly what Miriam had feared. 6 years earlier, after Luther Tate's death, unpaid taxes had forced the parcel to public sale. Purchaser, Abel Grayson. Samuel turned another page. Abel had paid the property taxes every year since. No mortgage, no improvements filed, no resale, no grazing claim, nothing. He never used it? Miriam asked. Samuel rubbed his thumb along the edge of the book. Not according to county record. Why buy it? Samuel looked toward the closed office door. Some papers were filed with private instructions. I can't speak beyond what belongs in the public book. Miriam closed the ledger. Outside, clouds were already pushing back over the mountains. She rode home through falling snow. Every small kindness she had noticed now felt different. The lantern, juniper, the lower woodpile, the room with her initials. Were those acts of care? Or the habits of a man who had known for years that some part of her life already sat inside his strongbox? Abel was mending a harness at the kitchen table when she returned. Miriam removed her gloves. Then she placed the tax deed between them. The leather strap in Abel's hands went still. You own my father's land. He did not deny it. Yes. For 6 years. Yes. You watched me save money to buy back a parcel you already had. Abel set the harness down. Miriam's voice stayed low. That was the only way she trusted it. You let me come to your door and bargain for a roof. He stood, not toward her, away from the table. Then he went into the back room. When he returned, he carried the strongbox. He opened it and took out a folded deed, 6 years of tax receipts, and a second document already signed. He placed them in front of Miriam. Quit claim. She looked at him. You prepared this? A while ago. Her fingers tightened around the edge of the table. Why? You can take it to Samuel tomorrow. He'll transfer the parcel to you. How much? Nothing. Miriam gave a short breath that almost became a laugh, but there was no humor in it. That isn't an answer. It's your land. It hasn't been mine for 6 years. Abel's face changed very little, but his hands opened at his sides. Miriam looked at the receipts. Every tax payment, every year, paid by him. You knew I had nowhere to go when I came here. I knew what you told me. You knew more than I did. Abel held her eyes. I heard every term you gave me. I meant to honor everyone. And the room? Silence. The initials? More silence. Miriam stepped closer to the table. Why did you buy the Tate parcel? Abel looked down once. When he spoke, his voice was quieter. I wanted you to have a choice I could not take from you. The words landed wrong, not because they were cruel, because they were too careful. Miriam shook her head. Choice isn't something you protect by hiding half the truth. Abel said nothing. You decided what I should know. You decided what I should not know. And all the while I stood here thinking I was making a bargain between equals. You were. Was I? That was the first time Abel looked wounded. He covered it quickly. Miriam gathered the quitclaim deed and the receipts. I'm staying with Edna a few days. Abel's jaw tightened. But he did not tell her she could not go. He did not remind her they were married. He did not mention the snow. He only walked to the barn. By the time Miriam packed a small valise, Juniper stood saddled near the porch. Abel checked the cinch once, then again. He slipped a pair of dry wool gloves into the saddlebag. Miriam noticed. Neither of them mentioned it. At the mounting block, Abel stepped aside. There was enough strength in him to stop a frightened horse, drag a fence post from frozen ground, or block the road if he chose. He did none of those things. Miriam put her boot in the stirrup. For 1 second, she looked down at him. Abel's hand rested against Juniper's neck. Then he took it away. Miriam rode toward Ash Creek without looking back. That night, wind rattled the shutters behind Edna Pritchard's general store. Miriam sat at a narrow table with her father's old ledger open beneath a kerosene lamp. Page after page held freight tallies, feed costs, wagon repairs. Then she found a note written in Luther Tate's hand. 6 years old. Wesley Dyer had offered to buy the parcel before the tax sale. Reason, wagon road access. Water rights. Miriam read the line again. A knock sounded at the back door. Edna opened it. Samuel Phelps stood outside with snow on his hat and a sealed envelope in his hand. "This belongs to you now," he said. Inside was a written instruction filed by Abel 6 years earlier. If Miriam Tate ever wished to reclaim the parcel, ownership was to be transferred to her without profit. One line had been underlined. "Do not use my name to persuade her to accept it." Miriam lowered the paper. The room seemed suddenly too quiet. Abel had not bought her father's land to take it from her. He had bought it before Wesley Dyer could, and for 6 years he had waited for her to choose it herself. Edna closed the back door against the wind and slid the bolt into place. Miriam still held Abel's old instruction in both hands. "How much do you know?" she asked. Edna took her time answering. "Enough." The stove gave a soft iron pop. Outside, sleet brushed the window glass. Edna sat across from her. "6 years ago, Wesley Dyer heard your father's parcel was going to tax sale. He wanted the road frontage. More than that, he wanted the creek access." Miriam looked down at Luther's ledger. "Abel knew?" "He found out the day before the sale." Edna folded her hands. "He rode nearly 40 miles before dark to get the money in. Came back with his horse white with sweat and mud to the belly." Miriam said nothing. "I asked him why," Edna continued. "That was more money than a young rancher should have spent on land he didn't need." "What did he say?" Edna's mouth tightened with the memory. "He said you and Luther had spent years making something out of that place. Said grief shouldn't be the reason another man got to take it." Miriam's thumb moved along the edge of Abel's letter. Then she asked the question she had been avoiding. "Why me?" Edna leaned back. "Because he'd noticed you long before you ever noticed him." Miriam's eyes lifted. Edna shook her head before she could speak. "Not like that. Ash Creek isn't a city. Folks see each other." She reminded Miriam of the freight yard 6 summers earlier, when a cattle buyer had tried to short an older teamster by $4, and Miriam had stood beside the scale until the count was corrected. She reminded her of the afternoon Miriam argued with Luther outside the general store about building a proper stock stop beside the wagon road. And Juniper. Before the mare belonged to Abel, she had been kept at the livery stable. "Abel saw you ride her more than once." Miriam stared at the flame behind the stove grate. All those small things, public things, ordinary things, things she had forgotten. "He built that room 3 years ago," Edna said. Miriam turned back. "The office?" "Yes. For what?" "He told folks it was for freight business." Edna got up, crossed to a cabinet, and returned with a yellowed lumber order. "I kept this because he never picked it back up." Miriam unfolded it. Boards, nails, window glass, hardware. On the back, in Abel's heavy hand, was one line. Enough room for Tate's ledgers. Miriam read it twice, then once more. She took off her gloves. A moment later, she put them back on, then removed them again. Edna watched but said nothing. That hurt more than any speech might have. Abel had not begun caring for her when she ran out of choices. He had wanted the sharp-minded woman at the freight scales, the woman arguing about routes and water and wagon turnover, the woman who still had a father, a job, a plan, a future that did not include him. Miriam folded their lumber order carefully. "Why didn't he ask me?" Edna gave a tired little smile. "You've met Abel Grayson." That answer sat between them. Miriam looked toward the dark window. A man could be strong enough to set a fence post alone and still be afraid of one honest sentence. She almost laughed. She almost cried. Instead, she reached for the freight papers she had carried from the ranch. Love could wait another night. Numbers could not. She worked until the kerosene lamp smoked. Duplicate hauling fees, weights that increased after leaving the Ash Creek scale, Advances listed as unpaid, even though herd deliveries had covered them. By midnight, Miriam had marked 4 ranches besides Abel's. Wesley was not leaning on one man. He was tightening a rope around half the valley. Edna found a notice under the front door before dawn. Dyer had called the affected ranchers to the courthouse the next morning to settle their accounts. Miriam read it once, then began arranging receipts by date. She slept less than an hour. At first light, the storm had broken. Snowmelt ran in narrow silver lines along the road as Miriam saddled Juniper and rode for Grayson Ranch. She found Abel near the south fence. A young calf had pushed into a section of broken rail. Abel had one shoulder under a heavy timber, lifting just enough to free the animal. He saw Miriam. The post settled back into the mud. Abel straightened. For a second, neither of them moved. His coat was wet at the sleeves. Mud streaked one knee. He was close enough now that Miriam could see the tiredness beneath his eyes. Still, he did not come toward her. He waited. Miriam dismounted and took a tied bundle of papers from her saddlebag. She set them on the hitching rail. Wesley called a settlement at the courthouse tomorrow. Abel looked at the bundle. I know. He's charging you twice on freight. Others too, some weights have been altered after the scale. Abel's face hardened. Miriam raised one finger before he could speak. I can prove it. That stopped him. But only if you let me do it my way. Abel looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. You'll speak? Yes. In front of Dyer? In front of everyone. Another nod. No argument. No protective order. No attempt to take the papers from her. Miriam looked at him. That mattered. More than she wanted it to. Abel wiped one hand on his coat. And after tomorrow? There it was. The question he had spent years refusing to ask. Miriam's throat tightened. She kept her voice steady. Tomorrow we save the ranch. She picked up the bundle and placed it back into her saddlebag. After that, neither of us gets to hide behind survival. Something moved across Abel's face. Small, unprotected. Then gone. He stepped aside so she could pass. But this time Miriam did not ride away. The courthouse was already full by 9 the next morning. Wet boots tracked mud across the plank floor. Ranchers stood along the walls with hats in their hands, talking low while Samuel Phelps arranged papers at the clerk's table. Owen Beck leaned near the door, watching more than speaking. Wesley Dyer stood at the front, with 3 account books stacked beside him. Abel entered behind Miriam. Heads turned. They always did when Big Grayson walked into a room. Wesley noticed too. A thin smile crossed his face. Didn't know you needed your wife to settle cattle business for you. Abel stopped. Miriam felt the room tighten around him. Wesley stepped closer. Thought a man your size handled his own affairs. Abel's hands remained at his sides. Then he looked at Miriam. Slowly, he pulled off his gloves. He placed them on the wooden rail and stepped back. The space in front of the table belonged to her. Miriam opened the first ledger. You charged Grayson Ranch twice for the November 5th wagon. Wesley's smile faded. Clerical error. Then you made the same error on the Harland account. A rancher near the wall lifted his head. Miriam laid 2 receipts side by side. Same wagon number, same driver, same cattle count, 2 freight charges. She turned another page. And these weights were changed after leaving the Ash Creek scale. Wesley reached toward the papers. Miriam covered them with one hand. Samuel. The clerk stepped closer. She showed him the figures. A second rancher came forward. That's my receipt number. Then another. Mine too. The room changed. Not loudly. That was what made it worse for Wesley. Men who had entered angry now began reading. Listening. Counting. Miriam moved through every line without raising her voice. One advance listed as unpaid had already been covered by a herd delivery in October. Two feed charges appeared under different dates, but carried the same merchant mark. A third cattle weight had somehow gained nearly 600 pounds between the local scale and the final invoice. Wesley shoved a hand toward the ledger. Abel moved once. One arm came between them. Nothing more. No punch, no threat. Just a barrier Wesley could not move through. Abel's face stayed still. "Don't." That single word carried across the room. Then Abel stepped back again. Miriam continued. By noon, Samuel had gathered Dyer's account books and several receipts into county custody pending review. Owen Beck stood beside a Wesley at the door. "You can leave town when these records are cleared," he said. "Not before. No handcuffs. No spectacle. Just consequence." The ranchers refused to sign Dyer's settlement. Claims against Grayson Ranch and 3 others were suspended until the accounting could be checked. Outside, sunlight broke through the clouds for the first time in days. Miriam stood on the courthouse steps with her papers under one arm. Abel came out behind her. "You saved the ranch," he said. She looked at him. "We saved it." He shook his head once. "You did the part that mattered." Miriam held his gaze. For a man who had spent years hiding important things, he was learning to say them plainly. A few days later, Samuel completed the transfer of the Tate parcel. Miriam signed her name beneath the description of the land her father had once owned. This time the deed came home with her. Her wages from Grayson Ranch were paid in full. 2 wagon drivers signed spring agreements to water stock and change horses on her parcel once the road dried. She had land, income, work waiting, and a small cabin on the property that could be repaired before summer. She no longer needed Abel Grayson's roof. That knowledge mattered. So she rode back to the ranch. Her trunk was already on the porch. Abel was lifting it into a wagon. He thought she had come to leave. Miriam let him finish. He tied the rope across the trunk, pulled the knot tight, then stepped away. "The first time I came here," she said, "I needed your roof." Abel went still. "This time I don't." His eyes dropped once toward the wagon. Then he nodded. Not asking. Not holding. His hand slipped from the sideboard. Miriam watched him release it. Only then did she speak again. "That's why I'm staying." Abel looked up. For several seconds, neither moved. Then something in his face softened. Not surprise exactly. Relief. The kind a man feels when he finally understands he was never going to be rewarded for waiting. He was being chosen. By April, snow remained only in white seams beneath the pines. The Tate parcel had changed. A new hitching rail stood beside the road. A water trough had been repaired. Fresh boards covered the worst part of the old cabin roof. Abel supplied lumber, 2 spare horses, and grazing along the north edge. Miriam supplied everything else. Contracts, rates, schedules, her name. The sign went up on a clear morning. Tate Crossing. Abel held the ladder while Miriam drove the last nail. Weeks later, while checking an old ranch ledger, she found one line written in Abel's hand years before. She carried the book onto the porch. Abel was sitting with coffee, watching the first spring wagons move along the road below. Miriam opened the page. She ought to own something no man can take from her. Abel stared at the sentence, then at her. "You wrote that." "I did." "Why didn't you ever say the things that mattered when you still had time?" Abel looked out toward the road. "I'm learning." Miriam pulled the second chair closer. Slowly. "Seems that way." The corner of his mouth moved. This time, she saw the smile. Below them, wagon bells carried across the thawing valley. Miriam sat beside the man she had once married, because winter left her nowhere else to go. Now she had land in her own name, money she had earned, a business that could stand without him. And still, she stayed. Abel had spent years loving her by keeping his distance. Now he was learning something harder. how to let her stand beside him. Neither of them said anything more. They didn't need to. The road ahead was open. They didn't need to. The road ahead was open. And maybe that was what Miriam and Abel had been searching for all along. Not a life without hardship. Not a promise that winter would never return. Just a place where neither of them had to surrender who they were in order to be loved. Miriam first rode to Grayson Ranch because 9 days stood between her and losing nearly everything. She married Abel because survival demanded a choice. But that was not the choice that defined their story. The one that mattered came later, when the Tate land was hers again, when work waited for her in spring, and when she finally had somewhere else she could go. She stayed. And Abel, a man strong enough to move timber with his hands, had to learn a quieter kind of strength. He had to stop protecting love with silence. He had to trust Miriam with the truth, with the ranch, and finally, with the freedom to walk away. Maybe love is worth the most when it isn't a debt, a rescue, or a locked door. Maybe it becomes real when someone is free to leave, and still pulls a chair closer. So if you had been standing in Miriam's place, with your own road finally open before you, would you have stayed? Tell me in the comments. And if stories about ordinary people carrying quiet courage through hard country mean something to you, subscribe and stay with us. There are more Western stories ahead. Stories of love, buried truths, second chances, and people finding their way home when they least expect it.